Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and I am so excited because today starts the 2021 World Chess Championships. We have been waiting 3 years for this tournament. It is finally here. I'm going to give an introduction into the tournament, and then we'll go ahead and jump into game number 1. So this tournament last was played in 2018. Magnus Carlsen defended his championship against Fabiano Caruana. It was supposed to be last year, but with the pandemic, it was delayed until this year. It also meant that the Candidates tournament, it's kind of a 2-year span to figure out who's going to play in the Candidates tournament. Winner of the Candidates tournament goes on to play the defending champion. That got stretched out to 2 years as well. So there was a break after 2020. They played the second half earlier in 2021, and Ian Nepomniachtchi was the winner of that tournament. So he goes on to face Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship. This is in Dubai. This is going to be a best of 14 series, meaning that the first 1 to 7.5 points, you get 1 point for winning, you get half a point for a draw. So first 1 to 7.5 points is going to be victorious. They are going to play 3 days on, then they're going to take a rest day, they're going to play 2 days on, and then they're going to repeat that. So rest day, 3 days, rest day, 2 days, rest, and then so on and so forth. So the time control, 120 minutes for the first 40 moves. After that, they're going to get 60 minutes. And then after 20 more moves, they're going to get 15 minutes added on for the rest of the game. So your typical classical chess, and these players have actually met 13 times before in classical chess. And if you remember any of my coverage of the Candidates tournament, I said Ian Nepomniachtchi is probably the most qualified person to beat Magnus Carlsen in classical chess because they've played 13 times. Magnus Carlsen's only won 1 of those. There were 8 draws, and Ian Nepomniachtchi actually won 4 of those. So he knows what it takes to beat Magnus Carlsen. Now, I do think Magnus Carlsen in a long series like the World Championship is better than anyone out there, maybe better than anyone that's ever played the game. He can really just grind down his opponents, and it's very, very difficult to find an edge on him. So this is going to be a fantastic series. We're going to have coverage of every single match, be going over the highlights, some of the interesting spots that I found, give you my own commentaries. Hopefully you guys enjoy watching this. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into game number 1 of the 2021 World Chess Championships. So starting with the white pieces in game number 1 is Ian Nepomniachtchi. I'm just going to be referring to him as Nepo throughout this video. And then Magnus Carlsen playing the black pieces. So starts out with the Ruy Lopez, E4, E5, Knight F3, Knight C6. We see bishop here to B5, and then we get into A6. Bishop comes back here to A4. So getting into the closed defense. After knight to f6 here, we see castle on the king side. Bishop to e7, so more of a traditional approach for Magnus Carlsen. Typically now you'll see the bishop coming out to c5, just more of an active square for the bishop than coming here to e7, which, for 100 years prior to, maybe 10, 20 years ago, this was the preferred move, just bishop here to e7. So Magnus Carlsen kind of going back to the old school approach of bishop here to e7, preparing to castle on the king side here. Rook to e1, defending this pawn here on e4. And then after pawn to b5, bishop back here to b3, and then castle on the king side. And this is where it's always interesting in these tournaments. These players have teams that they're focused on, helping them prepare for these tournaments. They're studying different variations, figuring out what's going to work against their opponents. And so it's always intriguing to see how they are going to approach different openings against their opponents. And in this case, you typically see a martial attack here with something like c3, pawn to d5 here. But we see Nepo going with the anti-martial, and that is pawn to h3. Says, yeah, you're not going to play d5 right now. We can just take here and eventually just play knight here to c3. And this is where we start to see a kind of shift from your main line that you would typically see. And so this is the first time in the match that Magnus Carlsen actually took some time. Every move up until this point only took him about 5-6 seconds. But Magnus Carlsen took about 2 minutes to figure out, okay, how he wanted to play against this h3 move. Not your typical main line that you see. but no worries. He decides to play knight to a5, attacking this bishop here on b3. Knight takes here on e5. Knight takes here on b3, pawn takes. So we have a small exchange here. Bishop here to b7, pawn here to d3, and then pawn d5. And after the exchange here, queen to f3, and then bishop to d6. Now, this is an interesting variation that Magnus Carlsen decided to go on. After knight to a5, he decides to go ahead and give up material. So neither side right now has given up any material. Decides to go ahead and give up that pawn here on e5. There's the exchange right here on b3. And Magnus Carlsen does not get that pawn back that he gave up here on e5. So bishop here to b7. But then this defended by d3 also opens up for the dark square bishop to get involved for Nepo. Pawn to d5, there is the exchange right there. And so Magnus Carlsen, after queen f3, bishop here to d6, says, hey, I'm okay giving up that pawn in exchange for a bishop pair. So that's always going to be extremely powerful. And the double pawn here on the b file. And so a lot of people always ask, what separates these top players from others? And it's this ability to give up material for a long-term game. There's no immediate threat that Magnus Carlsen has. Yes, he's going to be able to control the center of the board a little bit better, and he does have the bishop pair, but he's thinking long-term how the positions of the pawn structures and how this board could take a turn in different directions, and how Magnus Carlsen actually thinks he can fare better even though he gave up that pawn. So from here, we see king to f1. Yes, we could have seen an exchange. Maybe queen takes here on d5. Knight takes, maybe bishop here to d2. But Nepo decides to go ahead and play king to f1 here, and then rook over here to b8. This rook here on a8 is controlling this pawn here on a6. So if there's ever any sort of exchange here on b7, this bishop would no longer be able to hold on to it. So wants to make sure right now at least that this rook is holding on to it. So decides to bring his rook over here to b8 to protect that. Now we do see an exchange in the center of the board. Queen takes here on d5. Knight takes, bishop here to d2. And then after pawn to c5, we have the knight come back here to f3. Now, just to show you some of the threats that Magnus Carlsen had, if we come back a few moves here and start to see, instead of the queen taking here, maybe Nepo decides to build up more of his pieces in the center of the board. Maybe bishop here to f4 says, hey, Magnus Carlsen has a lot of pieces controlling the center of the board. I want to get some pieces involved into the center as well. But this gets very difficult for white to hold on to. There's always the discovered attack after the queen moves. Bishop here to b7 now attacking this queen on f3. So the queen's got to get out of harm's way here. Maybe queen down here to d4. This is attacking this bishop here on f4, as well as the pawn here on b2. So really just need the bishop to move, and then queen takes here on b2. So Magnus is really controlling the center of the board, and there's no way for Nepo to really counterattack that. And so in this position, he did just decide correctly to go ahead and exchange, just because Magnus had too much of a presence in the center. And obviously, if you're up a pawn in material, it tends to fare better for you if you just exchange down a material. Closer you can get to the end game with a material advantage, that's going to be better for you than if your opponent has all of their major pieces attacking and controlling the center of the board. So after knight to f3 here, we see the rook come back here to d8. No longer has to protect this bishop here on b7. There's not going to be an exchange variation where that is going to fall here on b7. So knight to c3, quickly met by knight to b4. Looking at this, the bishop is no longer able to attack this knight here on b4. This pawn here can't just come up to c3, so very easy way for Magnus Carlsen to come here, attack this pawn, and if he ever wants to maneuver the knight around the board, this is one way to do that as well. Rook here to c1, defending the pawn here on c2. Decides to go ahead and bring his rook over here to c8. Then knight to e2, opening up for the bishop to attack the knight here on b4. Knight comes back here to c6, bishop here to e3, attacking this pawn, but that's fine. This bishop is doing a good job of defending that pawn here. Knight comes back here to e7, so you can see Magnus just trying to maneuver his knight around the board. Bishop's doing a good job of still controlling much of the center of the board here. Bishop here to f4. This is where I think Magnus Carlsen decides, you know what, I really don't have a strong attack, so I'm going to go ahead and trade down and then see if I can get either a draw here or my opponent can make a mistake. Because remember, part of the reason he gave up a pawn, he only has 6 pawns, his opponent has 7, so his opponent does have a material advantage, is because Magnus Carlsen had a strong central presence and he had the bishop pair. Magnus Carlsen in this spot decides to go ahead and exchange off, but after the exchange, he is allowing his opponent now to have 2 double pawns, both on the B file as well as the F file. And on the F file, there's no connecting pawn, so there's not a pawn on the E file or the G file, so this is going to be a pretty difficult way for white to try to hold on to all of the pawns. So if you look at it and say, yeah, going into the endgame, white has a pawn advantage. While that is true, it is definitely going to be hard for him to control and maintain that advantage, especially against Magnus Carlsen. So although Magnus is down a pawn in material, actually it feels like he is the one that has the best shot of breaking through. Now, after the bishop from b7 came down in exchange, this pawn here on a6 was left hanging. So after this exchange on f4 completes the exchange, then we do see the rook come down here to c6. Does need to maintain control of this a6 square because the rook here on a1 is still attacking it. Nepo continues with rook here to e1, controlling the open e file. Knight comes down here to f5, pawn to c3, knight over here to h4. This knight here on f5 was preparing to come over here to d4 potentially and attack this pawn here on f3. The pawn here on c3 stops the knight from coming here, but Magnus Carlsen decides, yeah, I can just come over here to h4 and attack this same pawn here, so that's fine. Rook here to e3. Just getting it to a more central square, also defending, not only controlling this e file, but now defending this square here on f3. But that you can start to see some of the vulnerabilities that white has in the position. These double pawns on the same file are very difficult to hold on to, and so you start to have to use some of your other pieces, potentially your king, to really hold on to that material, or Magnus Carlsen can really start to chip away, get back one of those pawns, and then have a strong attack. So king here to f8. Once the queens come off the board, you typically want to get your kings involved into the game. That's exactly what we see Magnus Carlsen starting to do here. Knight comes back here to g2. Knight here to f5, attacking the rook. Rook comes up here to e5. Pawn here to g6, just supporting this knight. So nice little outpost here on f5 here. Not going to be able to kick this knight away because remember there's no pawns here on the G file for white, and there's no pawns here on the E file. So you can just hang out here all day if Magnus Carlsen really wants to. Decides right now to come back to knight to G7, rook here to E4, and then pawn to F5. You know, it's very difficult for white to really figure out how does Nepo continue and improve his position. Rook to E4. I don't think it does too much, but I don't really know where he could go that would be an improvement. Pawn to f5, so does develop and have tempo, just forcing his opponent to come back. He could just play rook here to e3 to begin with, but that's fine. Knight here to e6. Both these players, we're at 32 moves right now, and they didn't have a ton of time. So part of this is always just slightly trying to improve your position, but also getting to move 40 so that you can get an additional hour of time. Because at this point, I think they only had maybe 15 or so minutes left. So don't have a ton of time on the clock here. Knight here to g2. B4, so starting to attack on the queen side of the board. Very important to hold on pressure for this c5 square because you never want your opponent to bring their knight here to b4 and attack this pawn over here on a6. That would put 2 attackers here, so you just don't want to have to worry about that. So that's something to think about from Magnus Carlsen's standpoint. You want to control this c5 square here. King to e2. Rook over here to b8 says, yeah, if you take with your pawn, I want to make sure I can take with my rook here. I don't want to have to take with my pawn here. King here to d2. decides to go ahead and take it with his own pawn. So yes, the pawn can recapture here, but remember, you can start to see some of the vulnerabilities of those double pawns. Now the rook can come down, take here on b3. So it took Magnus Carlsen over 24-ish moves around there to get that material back, but eventually he does. You can see he's always thinking of the long game here, and so he has a pretty good position. I feel like if anyone is going to win this, it could be Magnus Carlsen here. Both sides equal in material, but you can see white still has the double pawns here on the f-file. The black pawns are a little bit more connected, especially on the king side. 3 pawn chains that I don't think fare nearly as well from white's standpoint. So Magnus Carlsen, I think, has the slight advantage. Still going to be very difficult for him to turn this into a victory. King here to c2, attacking the rook. Rook comes back to b7. Pawn up here to h4 says, yeah, I need to start to attack on the king side, chip away at this pawn structure from black here. King to f7, rook down here to e1. King to f6, just centralizing that king a little bit. And now we get into the 40th move. So after knight e3 and then rook over here to d7, they do get an extra hour of time here. So at this point, you're kind of thinking, yeah, I don't know how this is going to continue. Maybe we see a lot of pressure from Magnus Carlsen, and we could see a very long game. We have definitely seen Magnus Carlsen play these really, really long games to try to wear out his opponent. You just never know exactly what you're going to get in these games. But we see knight to c4, rook over here to e7, knight to e5, rook here to d6. And then we see some repeating of moves. So knight to c4, rook to c6 here. And then we see just a repetition, and both sides decide, hey, after 45 moves, we are going to draw. So game number 1 is in the books, and we see a draw, which I think from Magnus Carlsen's standpoint, you start with the black pieces. That is going to be a success in his mind. And if you watch the post-game interview with him, he seemed pretty relaxed. You know, he seemed like he was in good spirits. Both players were joking around a bit. It was good to see them both enjoying the moment. It's going to be a fun series. I feel like in the first game here, they were both filling each other out, played some interesting new variations that we don't typically see. So I thought that was good. I thought Nepo came very well prepared. I just thought Magnus Carlsen defended extremely well today and did not allow Nepo to really do anything that I think he was probably preparing to do. But all in all, great first game. Hopefully you guys enjoyed game number 1. Hopefully you're excited for this entire series. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on the series, who you think is going to win, and what you're most excited about. So thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for game number 2.